obviously all practice right effort coming here this morning. This is the topic of our talks. For the next number of weeks, we'll be talking about the 7 factors of enlightenment. And today I'm going to talk about the 3rd factor, the factor of effort, energy. So this, we're almost going in sequence, but this one a little bit out of sequence because this factor, all the factors permeate each other, but none as importantly as the factor effort. Because without the right energy, without the right effort, then mindfulness and investigation, tranquility, etc., all the way up to equanimity, these things, very difficult to bring them into fruition. So when we talk about right effort, we see that right effort exists in many of the teachings of the Buddha, from the Eightfold Path, the 6 paramitas, the 37 factors of enlightenment, prerequisites to enlightenment, the 7 factors. Energy is always, and effort is always part of this. Just from a little bit of a scientific point of view, energy in our body is very important as well. Certainly, we're aware that when we're breathing, we're bringing oxygen from the outside into our bodies, but we may not be aware that this oxygen actually ends up going to every cell in our body. And the reason that the oxygen goes to the cells in our body is because it needs to interact with other enzymes and chemicals in the body to produce what is called ATP. Because without ATP, we don't have any energy. ATP is the universal energy currency of all life. Plants, animals, humans, all life runs on ATP. So this metabolic pathway that creates ATP, called the Krebs cycle, very important because it takes the food that we eat and it combines it with the oxygen that we breathe, and that produces the energy. If we don't have the food, or if we don't have the breath, then life as we know it cannot continue. A little bit of a personal aside is that this last week, our family has been sitting in vigil for one of our dear relatives. My wife's family, we have 5 people over the age of 87. And the youngest, 87, had emergency heart surgery last Saturday, and he's been on the edge of whether or not he's going to be able to return to his normal functioning or whether he will pass away. So on Tuesday, they decided to it was time to remove the breathing tube. So I went to the hospital, took off from work, went to the hospital, because not very many people were available to help his wife in the decision-making process. She's 90. So the decision-making process, if he's unable to breathe on his own, do we continue him on the breathing apparatus or not, the ventilator? So fortunately, able to breathe on his own, but still the mind has not recovered. Still not really, the body is not recovering so well. So we have to face to the impermanence. We see that the ATP in the body not being utilized so well, and he may etc., may not survive this difficult time. So we bind together always as a family to be of support to each other, and we observe our own minds and the minds of others to see how we face to this impermanence. We have to use the right effort, the right energy, not to hold too strongly, but also to be able to let go if need be. So we have to investigate, pay attention. So we use our mindfulness and our investigation, and we put forth the necessary energy to be able to liberate our mind from any suffering that we may experience. So there are 4 steps to cultivating this correct energy, this correct effort. Which 4? To guard the mind, to abandon what it is that is unwholesome, to develop what is wholesome, and to maintain what is wholesome. These are the 4 efforts that we make. So today I'm going to talk a little bit about these 4 efforts and how we can develop and cultivate this ability. When in the 37 prerequisites to enlightenment, there's a sequence. We start with mindfulness, the 4 foundations of mindfulness, and then we practice the 4 efforts. So upon realizing that restraining and guarding is so important, when I was really focusing on this in my own practice some years ago, I realized how important it is to first be able to pay attention to what the mind is doing and to guard against falling into unwholesomeness. So in the original teachings of the Buddha, he talks about guarding and abandoning, developing, and maintaining. These are the 4. In the Mahayana tradition, in the Chinese tradition, this is called the 4 kinds of correct endeavor. I'm going to defer to my Bodhisattva friend, Caddy for the Chinese, Shushu, Shuzhongqing. And the first one is called to extinguish what is unwholesome. There's a correction. I'm talking about the 4 kinds of correct effort. Right. Mm-hmm. And then the extinguishing of the unwholesomeness, part 1. The second is working not to produce unwholesomeness. And then working at producing new goodness. And then nurturing pre-existing goodness. Thank you. Yes. And from the Yogacara Bhumi Shastra, there is also a division into 4 parts. One is called restraint elimination, wherein one guards the senses, not allowing the arising of unwholesome mental states. I'll ask Kathy to do those as well in Chinese for us.
This is 四正断 the one there.
Yes.
And then the first one is 律仪断.
And then what's called elimination, where one repeatedly eliminates unwholesome mental states as they are produced.
断
And then cultivation elimination, wherein one eliminates unwholesome states by cultivating the right path.
修断
And then eliminating according to prevention,
随护断
where one accords with and maintains undefiled practices, not allowing unwholesome mental states to arise. So you see that in the Mahayana tradition also, the Chinese tradition, really almost identical for kinds of practices. So what does it mean to use the exertion or the energy to guard? So this is from the suttas. There is a case where a monk, on seeing form with the eye, does not grasp at any theme or variations, by which, if he were to dwell without restraint over the faculty of the eye, unwholesome, unskillful qualities, such as greed or distress, might assail him. He practices with restraint. He guards the faculty of the eye. He achieves restraint with regard to the faculty of the eye. Similarly with the ear, nose, tongue, body, and intellect, mind. This is called exertion to guard, restraint. So, it's as if the eye, for example, falls upon something that is an object of desire, and we notice our selfishness, our greed, our intense desire for this arising in the mind. We immediately notice it, we guard against it, and we say to ourselves, this will only bring me suffering to wish for this, to want this. I need to let this go. In abandoning, what is the exertion to abandon? There is the case where a monk does not acquiesce to the thoughts of sensuality that have arisen in him. He abandons it, destroys it, dispels it, wipes it out of existence. He does not acquiesce to a thought of ill will, a thought of violence, any evil, unskillful qualities that have arisen in him. He abandons them, destroys them, dispels them, wipes them out of existence. This is called the exertion to abandon. So when the thought arises in the mind, oh, I don't like what's happening. Oh, I dislike this person. And the abandoning effort is to let go of this, to abandon it, destroy it, dispel it, wipe it out, so that this does not take root in the mind. And what is it to develop the exertion to develop? There is a case where a monk develops mindfulness as a factor for awakening, dependent on seclusion, dispassion, cessation, resulting in letting go. He develops investigation of qualities, persistence, rapture, serenity, concentration, and equanimity as factors for awakening, dependent on seclusion, dispassion, cessation, resulting in letting go. This is called the exertion to develop. So here very specifically, the wholesome qualities that we are wanting to develop are those which provide us with the opportunity to not attach ourselves, to not have such strong, willful desire, selfish desire, so that a person can be able to practice quietly and without strong urges, so that the mind becomes a state of peacefulness where many of the thoughts that disturb the mind, the feelings, the external distractions pass away, and the mind becomes clear. And then the qualities of strong, good energy, the deeper qualities of absorption and concentration and equanimity can arise in the mind. And so these factors can help us in the development of our path towards liberation. And eventually maintaining, what is the exertion to maintain? There's a case where a monk maintains a favorable theme of concentration, the skeleton perception, the worm-eating perception, the livid perception, the festering perception, the falling apart perception, the bloated perception. This is called exertion to maintain. And what this means here is that the person, instead of attaching to objects or a body, in this case, as being desirable, the person is able to see, oh, this is just an old skeleton. This will one day be full of worms. This is going to be one day bloated with all the gases of decomposition and fermentation that take place when passing away of this body when it's time. Therefore, I will maintain an attitude of dispassion and not attach. Instead, I will be calm and peaceful. This need to hold on, we look at it and we see that it is basically unwholesome. So we learn how to let go. So again, guarding or restraining oneself from unwholesomeness, abandoning the arising of unwholesomeness, developing the arising of wholesomeness, and maintaining the cultivation of wholesomeness, these are the four great efforts. In another discourse, the Buddha says, just as a competent carpenter or carpenter's apprentice with a slender pin will knock out and remove and dispose of a thicker one, so also, when through dwelling on some idea it comes to him unwholesomeness, unsalutary considerations connected with desire and hate and delusion arise in the monk, he should then engender his mind an idea other than the former idea, and connected with salutary things, wholesome things, whereupon the evil, unwholesome, unsalutary considerations will disappear, and with their disappearing, his mind will become settled, subdued, unified, and concentrated. I particularly like this idea of the small pin that you knock the big pin out. Tamasaro Bhikkhu, one of the great teachers of our time, who lives in Southern California at Metaforest Monastery outside of San Diego, has written many wonderful commentaries. And his commentary on effort says that the 7 factors of enlightenment have several different types of patterns. One is a spiral pattern where you go from mindfulness to investigation to effort and so on. And this spiral pattern turns into the development of those qualities that are needed to enter into the higher states of concentration, into the jhanas. So in the suttas, they talk about how the feeding of the factors for awakening is needed to starve what's called the hindrances, the mental qualities that have been there that actually get in the way of our being able to enter into the higher states of concentration. The higher states of concentration are right there in easy access for all of us, except that things get in the way. So we have to remove the hindrances. So we feed the factors for awakening, those being mindfulness and investigation and energy so far, and those then in turn starve the hindrances, which I'll talk about in a moment. The second pattern that Tanasawa Bhikkhu talks about is the pattern that he calls a holographic pattern, namely that all of the factors actually exist within one, and one exists within all. So they're all interconnected and interdependent on each other. The most difficult of the patterns to uproot in the mind, one of the hindrances that's most difficult, actually a special kind of type of hindrance called the fetters, which I'm going to discuss here, is that, and I'm going to read from Tanasawa Bhikkhu, according to the text, the most insidious issues that we can excite uncertainty are questions that center on the concept of I. Do I exist? Do I not exist? In the cosmological and metaphysical mode, this concept leads to such questions as, does the self exist? Does it not exist? In the psychological or personal narrative mode, it leads to a sense of self-identity, attachment to the object with which one identifies, and all the suffering inherently results. Neither mode, this concept leads to uncertainty about the past and the future. Did I exist in the past? Will I exist in the future? What will I be? So this sense of self is one of the more difficult aspects for us to overcome, and it's actually not spoken of necessarily in the hindrances, but it's spoken of in terms of what are called the fetters. This is a wonderful book by Bhante Gunaratana. It's called The 8 Mindful Steps to Happiness. And this text has a wonderful chapter on right effort that I recommend. And he talks at the beginning about wholesomeness and unwholesomeness and the 4 types of right effort. And then he goes into talking about how when we cultivate right effort, we're able to sweep away the fetters and the hindrances. And he makes a very beautiful connection between the fetters and the hindrances. He says the fetters are like the wind, and the hindrances would be like a tornado. So the wind is the force, and then as it's swept up into a particular type of storm, then it coalesces into a hindrance. Bhante G, as we call him, is 94 years old, I think, somewhere around there. He says, if you want to weed a garden, you have to be able to distinguish the weeds from the flowers. The same is true here. At the beginning, we find our mental gardens choked with weeds. We identify and remove the unwholesome qualities, such as anger, and replace them with useful, skillful qualities, such as loving friendliness. There are basic roots to what is unwholesome: greed, hatred, which is the flip side of greed, and delusion or ignorance. You can think of greed in combination with ignorance as the root of all mental weeds. Greed manifests as 10 deep, powerful psychic irritants called the fetters. These are distortions of understanding that affect your thoughts to flow directly into suffering. I particularly like that sentence because it says that what it is that's going on is that we're actually, because of our ignorance and because of our self-absorption, we are actually causing our own thoughts to flow directly into suffering. So there are these 10 fetters. This is not really a talk about the fetters, but I just want to identify that the first of these 10 fetters is called the identity view. And when I look at the 10 fetters and see that the first one is identity view, it's always been kind of daunting because the identity view is very difficult to let go of. And that's the first one. The next two are not so difficult for me. Doubt and grasping incorrectly at rules and rituals, I don't struggle with those so much, but identity view, that's a tough one. So when we move to try to understand these fetters, it means bound with frustration. Samyojana is the Pali term. Bound with frustration. I certainly know what that feels like. It binds the mind to a cycle of suffering. And in a way, it becomes like a kind of obsession. Because in a colloquial meaning, not in a clinical one, a person can end up being obsessed, kind of in a persistent, repetitive, and way that makes them feel bad when they stay stuck on wanting something in particular, or even holding on to their ego identity. This is a difficult one to overcome. So there are 7 ways that the mind can become obsessed. This term in Pali Anusaya. An obsession with sensual passion, an obsession with resistance, an obsession with views, an obsession with uncertainty or doubt, an obsession with self-conceit or pride, obsession with a passion for becoming, and an obsession with ignorance. These are the 7 types of obsession. So when we look at these obsessions, number 6, the passion for becoming can also be like passion for existence, to remain alive. So when we look at these and we try to understand what does it mean to overcome this identity view, the Buddha spoke about this belief in a permanent self as something that can really get in the way of our progress. So we have what are called the 5 aggregates that form what we are: the physical, the emotional or feelings, the perceptions, and the habit of our thoughts, and our consciousness. These would be the 5 aggregates or skandhas. These aggregates, we can see them incorrectly in 4 ways. We can say that the aggregates are identical with some kind of self, or that the aggregates contain or possess a self, or that the self possesses the aggregates. Third, that the self is caused by the aggregates, or the aggregates are caused by the self. Or fourth, that the self is one thing and the aggregates are yet another separate entity, and they coexist together. So all of these views are troublesome. These are the views that create this idea of our separate self that is somehow permanent. In Buddhism, we try to promote the idea within ourselves of how we are all interconnected, and that it would make very little sense for one of our fingers to suddenly pipe up and start saying, I am a separate finger. Don't you see how important I am? So this would be a silly notion for the finger to do that. In the same way, for our separate self to act in this way would be very silly. So it's the interconnectedness that we have to develop within ourselves. That's the wholesomeness that we wish to develop. So this first common fetter of identifying ourselves as some kind of separate entity, more important than others, having all of these desires that we have to fulfill while we're here, more important than others, this is what causes a lot of our suffering and our difficulty. And this is the first fetter to overcome. And again, in the Mahayana tradition, this is broken down into a number of different subcategories. Not sure we want to get into all of the subcategories because it gets a little confusing. So I'll leave that for another time. And one of the schools of the Mahayana tradition, the Yogacara school, again, divides this into 4 different types of difficulty that the mind has. One being called self-delusion, the idea that there is an all-important ego that can exist separately. A self-belief, the belief that there's an eternal self from its own side that exists separately. Self-conceit, the belief that one's egos and needs and wants all are more important than others. And then what's called a self-cherishing sense, that the belief that the attachment to the self needs to be gratified and reinforced. So these 4 erroneous views in Yogacara are dealt with. We see this evident in many of the sutras, the Mahayana sutras, and today when we do our chanting, we'll be doing a chanting from the Diamond Sutra. And you'll notice that the main text of the Diamond Sutra that from our last chapter is going to emphasize how it is that there is, the Buddha never speaks of a self view, a person view, a living being view, or a lifespan view. This is very much connected to this idea of dispensing with this identity so that a person can overcome this first fetter. So Bhante Ji says, out of the 10 fetters comes certain crude, extremely unwholesome mind states that prevent you from making any progress in your meditation or from doing things skillfully in your life, and we call these mind states the 5 hindrances. He says, if the fetter is like a wind, hindrance would be like a tornado. So these 5 hindrances are very important. One of the things that I find when I talk with people, many of whom have been meditating for a long time, and they say, oh, I'm not making very much progress. My meditation, I sit and I meditate, but I still get angry, I still get upset. There's lots of problems in my life. Why is it that I'm not making progress? And I ask them, so tell me about your work with the 5 hindrances. And they look at me and say, oh, I've never heard of the 5 hindrances. So then we talk about the 5 hindrances. Oh, this is really important. Because if a person is not aware of the hindrances, it's very difficult to make progress. The first hindrance is called kamachanda. This means the craving for sense-based pleasure. So it certainly could be a craving that would be sexual, but also it has to do with any kind of craving for sense-based pleasure. So when you're sitting in meditation and you're feeling uncomfortable, and you say, oh, I wish I didn't feel uncomfortable. This, in a sense, is a craving for sense-based pleasure. When you're sitting in meditation and you start thinking of that new piece of technology that you would like that just came out, the new phone, the new apps, your mind gets distracted by that. This is the craving for sense-based pleasure. So whenever we observe that, we say, oh, there's my mind going in this direction. And then we apply the 4 efforts. First, guarding the mind, abandoning, then developing the other pin to go in its place. Then we maintain the new attitude. Anger or ill will, bhayapada. This is a feeling of malice or harmfulness towards others. All of us go through life. People do things that cause us to suffer, to react negatively back to that person, to do them harm, to feel resentment. This just keeps us trapped in our own suffering. I particularly like the words of Mahatma Gandhi when he said, "An eye for an eye makes the whole world blind." So being able to notice that anger when it arises, we're all human, we have anger arising, we notice it. We don't let it stay there. We take the pin, we knock out the anger, we replace it with loving kindness, wishing that person well. When laziness, low energy, boredom, half-hearted actions, drowsiness arouses in the mind, sleepiness, this is another hindrance. We need to provide the right effort to overcome that as well. When restlessness, we're unable to calm the mind is jumping all around, this is another hindrance that we need to work with. Over a period of time, the mind becomes more and more tranquil. And then all the doubts that we have, the lack of conviction that we're capable of this, or trusting that the system will work for us. This is also something that we need to be able to overcome. So this craving for pleasure, feelings of ill will and malice, half-hearted action, the restlessness, the inability to calm the mind, this lack of belief and trust or faith in our abilities and in the system, these we need to overcome. So how do we overcome the sensual desire? We focus on the impermanence of form and all the aggregates. And we become mindful of the body. And we cultivate a sense of generosity. So instead of wanting things for ourselves, we give to others. We overcome anger or ill will by noticing the impermanence of feelings. We cultivate patience. We know that this feeling will pass. When it comes to laziness and sleepiness, we visualize the light within ourselves. We may do standing or walking meditation to keep ourselves focused. When restlessness takes over, we cultivate thoughts of tranquility and peacefulness, and we do mindfulness of the breath. When doubt arises, we focus on the goal of awakening, of liberation and enlightenment. We see those around us who are traveling this path, and we're inspired. So these are some of the practices that we can do that will help us to guard or restrain ourselves from unwholesomeness, to abandon the arising of unwholesomeness, to developing the arising of wholesomeness and maintaining the cultivation of wholesomeness. At this moment here, and in every moment in our lives, even to that moment when it's our time to let go of this physical body. May all beings have happiness and the causes of happiness. May all beings be free from suffering and the causes of suffering. May all beings never be separated from the altruistic joy, which is free from suffering. And may all beings dwell in the great equanimity, which is free from